Liberalism, Chapter 3. White Servants Between Metropolis and Colonies. Proto-Liberal Society. Section. Franklin, Smith, and Vestiges of Slavery in the Metropolis. First, the rebel colonists during the American Revolution, and then the South of the United States during the conflict that pitted it against the North, accused their opponents of hypocrisy. The latter waxed indignant over black slavery, but shut its eyes to the fact that what were essentially slave relations persisted within the society it held up as a model. As we know, Franklin compared the miners of Scotland to the blacks of the American plantations, and thus challenged the London government's pretension to elevate itself into a champion of liberty. Obviously, this was a polemical intervention, but one whose validity was confirmed by a rather authoritative witness. Although sharing the proud self-consciousness of his compatriots, or the ruling class of his country, Adam Smith acknowledged the persistence in Great Britain of, quote, vestiges of slavery. A labor relationship not dissimilar from serfdom was in force in salt works and coal mines. Just as the adscripti glebei, still very numerous in Eastern Europe, were forcibly bound to the land to be cultivated and sold at the same time as it, so in the country that had left behind the Ancien Regime some decades earlier, the adscripti operi were in a sense an integral part of the opus, or works, the salt work or mine, and, when this was sold, passed together with their family into the service of the new master. Hence, it was not a question of actual slavery, of chattel slavery, which allowed individual members of a family to be put on the market like any other commodity. The adscripti operi could marry and lead a genuine family life. They could own a minimum of property, and naturally they did not risk being killed with impunity. Quote, their lives are under the protection of the laws of the land. End quote. But it remained the case that in Scotland, workers in coal mines and salt works were obliged to wear a collar on which the name of their master was inscribed. In the wake of the great economist, Millard too could not but, quote, regret that any species of slavery should still remain in Great Britain, and it was hoped that the Parliament would intervene to remedy the situation, finally sanctioning, quote, the freedom of the laboring people in Scottish mines and salt works, end quote. Judging from Smith's Lectures on Jurisprudence, these were, quote, the only vestiges of slavery which remain amongst us, end quote. Does this mean that the other labor relations were based on freedom? Referring to England in the second half of the 18th century, Blackstone distinguished between three types of servant in the strict sense. We ignore here personnel charged with overseeing and guarding the master's property. Menial servants, or domestics, apprentices, and finally laborers, who worked outside the master's house. The most modern labor relation, least informed by feudal and servile echoes, would seem to be the last. In this connection, however, the great jurist indulged in celebrating, quote, very good regulations, on the basis of which, for example, quote, all persons who have no visible effects may be compelled to work, while those who, quote, leave or desert their work were punished. Over the domestic or apprentice, the master exercised a right of, quote, corporal punishment that must not result in death or mutilation, end quote. But what happened if this limit was exceeded? We can infer Smith's answer, quote, the master has a right to correct his servant moderately, and if he should die under his correction, it is not murder, unless it was done with an offensive weapon, or with forethought and without provocation, end quote. It is difficult to regard such servants as free men, even if, according to the great economist, they enjoyed, quote, almost the same privileges with their master, liberty, wages, etc., end quote. In fact, what creates a radical difference is the power of correction exercised by one over the other. The same Smith included menial servants, together with slaves proper, in the master's extended family. Masters did not confine themselves to monitoring their servants' industriousness. Let us attend to Hume's evidence. Quote, "At present, all masters discourage the marrying of their male servants, and admit not by any means the marriage of the females, who are then supposed altogether incapacitated for their service." End quote. The opportunity to have a family seems largely denied, not only to the black slave, but also to the white domestic servant. The private lives of both were subject to the master's power or will. Finally, it is to be noted that comparable to menial servants were, quote, apprentices, whose condition, in England at any rate, has been regarded by Grotius as approximating closely enough to the slaves. And such, basically, was also Blackstone's opinion. He reiterated the slave's obligation to provide service, quote, for life, with a rather eloquent argument. Fundamentally, it was the same relationship that the apprentice had had with his master, except that in the latter case, there was a time limit, 7 years, and sometimes more. As has justly been observed, quote, "For most of human history, the expression free labor was an oxymoron." End quote. An end of section.